I wanted to touch, like I said, I want to touch on that influence, man. And so I got this other video. It's called it like Invisible.
Influenced by the values of the culture that you grew up in. But not all cultures hold the same values. Some cultures tend to encourage behaviors that are loud, boisterous, and competitive. Others encourage quiet, respectful, and more humble behaviors. Depending on the culture where you live, you probably pick up on these values, and they have definitely influenced your decisions and your personality. Researchers have been studying the connections between culture and personality for a long time. I'm going to attempt to explain two spectrums that researchers have created to define cultures. The culture's place on these spectrums highly influences the personality traits and the behaviors of the people within that culture. So culture is not determined by borders. As you'll see throughout the rest of this video, people learn lessons from cultures that are created from people within a certain country, occupation, class, gender identity, or other differences. For example, just because the country you live in has an individualist culture does not mean you are bound by individualist ideas. So keep this in mind. Let's get started by talking about individual versus collectivist culture. Individualism focuses on the individual, just as the name implies. People living in an individualist environment prioritize self-improvement of themselves and satisfying their own needs before the rest of those of their community. Why? Well, individualist cultures believe and teach that if everyone takes care of themselves, then the entire group should thrive and then become self-sufficient. Individualist cultures put a lot of stress on independence and self-reliance. Those that live in this type of culture tend to be very self-sufficient and driven workers, but are weaker whenever it comes to collaboration and teamwork. They usually struggle handing off responsibility. Now, in general, these people usually distance themselves psychologically and emotionally from one another, since working with others is more of an option than a requirement for success. In the media, we often see individualist characteristics associated with men, people in urban settings, and the Western culture. So what about collectivist cultures? People living in a collectivist environment are taught to focus on the needs of the group before they focus on their own individual needs. They associate their identity to the role and function in a larger group. These groups can include families, teams at work, or the entire nation. Collectivist societies teach people that everyone will benefit when they start to look out for one another. Harmony and interdependence between group members is highly valued among people in this type of environment. Now, unlike their individualist counterparts, members of collectivist cultures tend to be extremely close to each other psychologically and emotionally. Now, this can create an us versus them mindset that separates or looks down upon people that are outside of their group. Collectivist characteristics are generally associated with women, people in rural settings, and Eastern culture. So look.
Wow, that's dope. Catch that? Yeah. So you got the individualist culture is full of people that spend a lot of time alone. More independent culture is more masculine, is more how men normally carry themselves. Or Western culture, you get what I'm saying? And then it was saying the more harmonious culture, right? There is more Eastern culture as well as more feminine, more women operate like that. You know, it says the people that's within their circle, they might be very close mentally and physically. But it might turn into a us versus them type of situation.
I can see that.
So it's like cliquish. But you know, just like we think about soft skills and how the U.S. I mean, how everything is set up with people that run the world. Basically, it's clicked up. It's definitely soft skills within that. So you kind of gotta be like, you gotta have a duality, you know what I'm saying? You gotta be balanced with the duality of both of them, you know?
Let's look at another spectrum. Did you grow up in an approach or an avoidance culture? This idea was coined in 1930.
Now you see how they constantly, a lot of stuff that we study and have to look at, why they always point out two sides. Now you know I'm big on like dichotomies or two sides of the same coin or duality, and I'm big on that because a lot of people try to separate things and they don't understand it's two sides. You can't have God without the devil. You can't have good without bad. You can't have illegal transactions without, you can't have legal transactions without illegal ones, you know?
35 to help psychologists identify what makes some conflicts easy to resolve and others difficult to resolve. Where you lie on this spectrum can highly influence how you make decisions. So, what is approach versus avoidance? Humans typically want to approach and move towards pleasurable things, and they typically want to avoid and move away from negative or painful things. It's very similar to Freud's pleasure-pain principle. The idea of approach versus avoidance was measured when an experiment was conducted on rats in 1948. The rats were exposed to different positive and negative stimuli. Researchers then measured the strength of their pull towards the stimuli. The most interesting results from this experiment revealed that the closer the rats were to the item that they were either approaching or avoiding, the stronger their pull was in either direction. Now this can be applied to humans and how they make their decisions and categorize conflict. But what does it have to do with the culture where you grew up with? Because that's kind of the topic of this video, right? The culture helps to teach you at a young age what to approach and what to avoid. Culture doesn't teach you to avoid physical pain and approach food. Those things are instinctual to all humans. The things we learn to approach and avoid through culture appeal to a higher need. One example of this is something called uncertainty avoidance. The uncertainty avoidance of a culture is a measure of how that culture responds to novelty and uncertainty. How does a culture deal with ambiguity? Are changes welcome in the nation? Or does the culture approach stable, traditional rules and customs? Now, in some research, I've found that countries who generally score high in neuroticism tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance. Those countries usually have a more formal system of rules that try to minimize cultural or situational ambiguity. And the citizens are uninterested in changing them. These cultures tend to be more conservative, more emotional, and usually xenophobic. Families in these cultures tend to have more traditional gender roles too. Schools have more structured learning, and children are taught to trust that their teachers have all of the answers. Children are also taught that the outside world may be a hostile place. Religions associated with the uncertainty avoidance include Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and Shintoism. Conversely, countries low in neuroticism and low in uncertainty avoidance tend to have fewer laws and regulations, and their citizens are much more interested in politics. These cultures are often more open to change and more tolerant of diversity, and people within these cultures tend to suppress their emotions more. Families in these cultures usually have looser gender roles, and their schools have a more open-minded learning. As a generality, teachers are allowed to say that they don't know, and students are encouraged to question authority. Children are also taught that the outside world is benevolent and that they should not persecute others based on their beliefs. Religions associated with low uncertainty avoidance include Protestantism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. So where do you fit in? Uncertainty avoidance is just one concept that is influenced by a culture's personality and how it influences the decisions and behaviors of the people within that culture. What were you taught to avoid? What were you taught to approach? And how does the culture where you grew up in influence what you consider to be comfortable and uncomfortable?
So, catching that?
Yeah, I'm catching that.
So you see where it mentioned neuroticism?
Yeah, definitely.
You know what it means for people to be neurotic, have more neuroticism? How does
so basically this is something that's just different. It's unique about the person. It's like they just have this about them where it's neurotic or it can be irrational.
I hope you guys
Right. And it kind of makes someone different, but also abstract with their ideas. And it can be a good thing. So I definitely feel I'm that way.
What, more neurotic?
I'm definitely more neurotic. Because it's like, a lot of things, the only thing that really is that a lot of things that I do or that I say I'm going to do is not what most people do. And it's not the route that most people take. And a lot of times, it's a good thing because most of the route people take is, honestly, it's just not really productive. It's the opposite. It's just for play. Just because it's cool. It's not really, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that. Not really too much of that. So yeah, definitely I would say that. What would you say about yourself?
Well, it says neuroticism is a trait disposition to experience negative effects, including anger, anxiety, self-consciousness, irritability, emotional instability, and depression.
Neurotic is more negative, huh?
That's what it's looking like, right?
Yeah, so that seemed like in that definition anyway.
Common neurotic traits: an overall tendency towards negative emotions, feelings of anxiety and irritability, feels. Poor emotional stability, feelings of self-doubt, being self-conscious or shy, experiencing moodiness, sadness, or depression, easily stressed or upset, unable to handle stress well.
Wow.
Dramatic changes in feelings.
Yeah, I like it. Not at all.
More
I didn't know that.
neurotic, more of a neurotic type of person. And it says common neurotic traits and overall tendency toward. Okay, so let me see what else we got down. Feelings of self-doubt, being self-conscious or shy, experiencing moodiness, sadness, or depression, easily stressed out or upset, unable to handle stress well, dramatic changes in feelings, lack of resilience or difficulty bouncing back after adversity, chronic worrying about a variety of things, tendency to interpret neutral situations as threatening. Ooh, I like it. I like this, but yeah, we done fell into the sweet spot, my nigga. Often view minor problems as overwhelming.
Not me.
You say you're very neurotic?
I'm kind of thinking of people that I know who are like that. So.
Nah, it's everybody else, man. I'm just messing with you, bro. You're like, nah, that ain't me, bro. I'm good. He said pineapples. I wasn't ready. It says difficulty controlling urges or emotions in the moment. Easily becoming jealous or feeling envious about what others have. Frustration or anger about everyday occurrences. Like, that's why I always say, look, you make your own day, man. I tell people, I have a good day every day because I make my day. I mean, it would be unreasonable, like I said in my first video I put online, it would be unreasonable for me to need everything to be perfect for me to have unconditional love for life. You get what I'm saying? So, what was that? It says, frustration, okay, so frustration or anger about everyday occurrences, feelings of fear or guilt over minor things. Causes of neuroticism. What might cause one person to score higher in neuroticism than another? Here are a few factors to consider. Brain function. A smaller scale study found that after viewing unpleasant images, people rated higher in neuroticism had lower oxygen levels in their lateral prefrontal cortex. That's the logical part of your brain, than those with lower neuroticism ratings. So, you know, it's gonna show whether you're more neurotic when your emotions and your body is going crazy. Your limbic system, the thalamus is shooting messages to your lizard brain or your amygdala, and it's reacting, you know, out of fight or flight, right? Versus if it's just level, like it might react a little bit and just like, oh, okay, you know, but you ain't overdoing it and flooding your brain with excess cortisone and inflating your brain, and then now you got, you know, all kind of different signals and all of that's going to be shot through the rest of the body, and now you got heavy heart rate, and you know, you lose your blood and all of that rushing to one place, and you know what I'm saying, you got the adrenaline, and it's gonna show on the scale, especially if they got got some shit hooked up to you, you know what I'm saying, that's supposed to pick it up, yet alone showing just from visibly seeing a person, you know, and how they move forward and trying to, or the lack thereof, their ability to cognitively function, you know.
Exactly.
So it says, this area of the brain plays a role in a variety of cognitive processes. So it says childhood trauma is another one that can cause neuroticism. Childhood trauma. Experiencing some type of trauma later in life doesn't appear to increase neuroticism, but exposure to these types of events when you're younger does seem to have an effect. You can kind of do a little therapy on yourself, think back to traumatic events if you know you had them in the past, or if you know you're very neurotic, It says climate, right? Your climate can. If you live in a climate that is prone to extreme weather patterns, it may increase your risk of neurotic personality traits, potentially due to poorer dopamine function as a result of climate stress. Wow. So just like when my parents came down to Florida, I remember my mom saying like, man, like, I really like it out here. I see why you always happy or whatever. Like, yo, I didn't feel a lot of aching in my body, this and that, such and such. Cause you live up north where it's cold as hell.
Exactly.
It's even cold up there for the cars, you know what I'm saying? You be having to warm the cars up. There's more wear and tear on the car. You think it's not gonna be more wear and tear on your body. And our bodies are made out of a high percentage of water. And as you get older, the water kind of like decreases. Then you have another thing that can make you more neurotic is gender. And that's simple, right? If you're a woman, it says one multicultural personality study found that women score higher for this trait in all the 22 countries studied. Although the gap between gender does appear to be smaller in the online world, it's thought that this is because you can be more anonymous online, which reduces worries over the what others might think of you, right? So it says genetics. Some researchers suggest that neuroticism is inherited, much the same as we inherit other traits, such as our height. Thus to a certain degree, we may be born with a tendency towards its particular personality trait, right? That's why we look at our parents to see how tall a person might be, or will they lose their hair or some shit like that, right? It's just survival. So I guess if you gotta survive, that'll definitely make you more neurotic. It has been argued that neuroticism may be rooted in evolution, as in some respect being hypersensitive to danger, which is obvious, or threats could offer a survival advantage, right? So that's why we always attract to negativity, because the oldest part of us is always fighting to help us survive, you know what I'm saying? If we didn't have that negative, we'd be in trouble. There's also some evidence that neuroticism may be correlated with the startle reflex, which is an involuntary response to loud noises. This suggests that people who are high in neuroticism may be genetically weird to react more strongly to outside stimuli. How neuroticism affects behaviors. Yeah, you want to say something about that last one I read? Says how neuroticism affects behavior. As mentioned previously, neuroticism may help people survive because they have a tendency to pay more attention to the negative outcomes, like we were just talking about, or risk. Research has also connected this trait with higher levels of academic success. On the other hand, neuroticism have negative effects on behavior. So you see how everything has a pros and cons, like we was talking about. Such as if you are unable to manage feelings or worry, in some cases, neuroticism may contribute to the development of mental health issues such as depression or anxiety. A 2019 study adds the neuroticism has the only big 5 personality traits that could significantly predict participants' cognitive decline. Like I see, it's crazy. I just put the video up on emotional intelligence, and like I tell people, if you don't have your emotional, psychological side intact, it can impair your cognitive ability. And here we go with this. They're talking about neuroticism. It's the same thing. Higher level of annoyance. People who are higher in neuroticism can sometimes be seen as annoying. For example, a person with neurotic behavior might grate on the nerves of those around them by being critical of others, being overly dependent on others, or asking for help instead of figuring things out for themselves, complaining a lot, constantly asking for reassurance, taking small issues and making them out to be bigger than they are. It says greater number of conflicts. Being highly neurotic can also lead to conflict with others if you become engaged over someone cutting you off in traffic, for example. You may decide to confront them. If minor problems send you over the edge, you might also yell or become angry at the people you feel have caused you stress. Some people high in neuroticism accuse others of doing things out of their own worry. This could show up in the form of accusing your spouse of cheating without any evidence, driving them away from you. Or you may blame friends for things in an overly aggressive way, which can hurt your relationships. I ain't trying to tell you, god damn, this shit hitting this shit. So it says, also, if you obsess over minor details and always strive for perfectionism, you might not complete tasks that other people ask you to do. This too can lead to tension and conflict, appearing unreliable, increased feelings of guilt, reducing well-being in your children, coping with neuroticism. So they got some different subjects on there. It's a good, this is something that we talk about, but it's good to have this other angle, to look through this other lens of neuroticism, like someone being more neurotic or less neurotic, or a certain people. Like this was talking about a certain people being more neurotic and a certain people not being neurotic. Now let's go back and listen to what it was saying about that, since we understand that a lot better, right?
Because that's kind of the topic of this video.
Okay,
but what does it have to do with the culture where you grew up with? Because that's kind of the topic of this video, right? The culture helps to teach you at a young age what to approach and what to avoid. Culture doesn't teach you to avoid physical pain and approach food. Those things are instinctual to all humans. The things we learn to approach and avoid through culture appeal to a higher need. One example of this is something called uncertainty avoidance. The uncertainty avoidance of a culture is a measure of how that culture responds to novelty and uncertainty. How does a culture deal with ambiguity? Are changes welcome in the nation? Or does the culture approach stable, traditional rules and customs? Now,
how do they deal with change? How do they deal with crisis, right?
Responds to novelty and
How do they respond to novelty and uncertainty?
How does a culture deal with ambiguity?
How does the culture deal with ambiguity, right? How do a person, and you can look at yourself, how do you as an individual deal with ambiguity? You can find out whether you're more neurotic or less neurotic, or at least balanced, because, it's not like it's all bad, right?
Are changes welcome in the nation, or does the culture approach stable, traditional rules and customs?
Is change welcome with this culture? Is change welcome in your life? Or do you rather like things to stay the same and be comfortable? You know what I'm saying? Do you get uncomfortable when things change and you get very neurotic when things change? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, it depends on the change. So
Say it again?
it depends on the change in the person, yeah.
Right.
Now, in some research, I've found that countries who generally score high in neuroticism tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance. Those countries usually have a more formal system of rules that try to minimize cultural or situational ambiguity. And the citizens are uninterested in changing them. These cultures tend to be more conservative, more emotional, and usually xenophobic.
So they like to keep things the same because they don't want to have conflict.
Yeah, definitely.
You know what I'm saying?
Families in these cultures tend to have cultural or certainty avoidance. Those countries usually have a more formal system of tenets and customs. Now, in some research, I've found that countries who generally score high in neuroticism tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance.
Uncertainty and avoidance, which is more feminine. That's why the woman more avoidant of conflict. And I'm just saying it's hard to win an argument, but but I didn't try to go there, bro.
Countries usually have a more formal system of rules that try to minimize cultural or situational ambiguity. And the citizens are uninterested in changing them. These cultures tend to be more conservative, more emotional, and usually xenophobic. Families in these cultures tend to have more traditional gender roles too. Schools have more structured learning, and children are taught to trust that their teachers have all of the answers. Children are also taught that the outside world may be a hostile place. Religions associated with the uncertainty avoidance include Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and Shintoism. Conversely, countries low in neuroticism and low in uncertainty avoidance tend to have fewer laws and regulations, and their citizens are much more interested in politics. These cultures are often more open to change and more tolerant of diversity, and people within these cultures tend to suppress their emotions more. Families in these cultures usually have looser gender roles, and their schools have a more open-minded learning. As a generality, teachers are allowed to say that they don't know, and students are encouraged to question authority. Children are also taught that the outside world is benevolent and that they should not persecute others based on their beliefs. Religions associated with low uncertainty avoidance include Protestantism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. So where do you fit in? Uncertainty avoidance is just one concept that is influenced by a culture's personality and how it influences the decisions and behaviors of the people within that culture. What were you taught to avoid? What were you taught to approach? And how does the culture where you grew up in influence what you consider to be comfortable and uncomfortable?
So, go ahead and break it down, Nick. I'm gonna let you take the floor first. Just your thoughts.
Well, yes, as you said, the ambiguity, call it being open to more than one interpretation or being open-minded. That can, like you said again, it can be affected by the people you're around as well. The people that you're around can make you feel like changing if that's what they kind of, everyone in your circle is on, but for the most part it's just being able to understand someone's point of view and just to see how to accept that, okay, this is, that person can think this way because I can see how that person would think this way, but to just not accept it or just to go against it completely would be the way you just saying, the neurotic way of going about it, where it's just like, oh no, that's wrong because I say this, and this is wrong because I say that, is because you're oversensitive about anything that's disagreeable to you.
Plus, you have the culture, the individualist culture, that's actually more of the culture that will encourage people to be more of an individual instead of so much off of influence. And society nowadays is more feminine in a certain way, right? And so it makes sense why everybody's so impressionable, even more impressionable, right? Even men, right? With us talking about this subject of being impressionable or being influenced. It's Western at this time, but it could shift in the future. But right now, the Western is more likes to gravitate towards the more masculine traits, right? So in turn, the feminine is not going anywhere. It just has to move around, right? And so if man already been on the masculine side, right, geared up more masculine, and then women come on the masculine side, it's a lot of men that it's kind of moving over to the feminine side, making room. You know, it's kind of like naturally, even if you don't want, or if you wanted things to stay balanced, right, it's not in your control or my control or our control.